And this is technically not a game of the week. This was played quite a bit later. But it was played. When was this played? Actually, it was played. I want to say, maybe a month ago or so. I've already lost dates, and it's really funny because I was saving some notes that so the date on the game is actually wrong. But it was something like this, and it was a really really cool game. I think it was about a month ago though, and this was between Grischuk and MVL, and I really enjoyed going over this. So I would say that, how would I put this? Like, one of the favorite things I like to do when a tournament's going on, like a really major tournament, is I try to follow the games and I try to figure things out as best as I can as I go. It's one of my favorite things to do when when a big tournament's going on, and I try to figure it, follow it on my own, and try to figure out what the players are up to. And I kind of wanted to do that with you. I'll show you some analysis and stuff like that, but I also kind of want to show how I go over these games myself because I'm trying to learn from them. And I would say that I could show you, okay, this is probably the best here. This is what I checked out. But in a lot of ways, I much prefer to kind of go over them organically. And so this is how I learn from these games. And this is how maybe you guys can try to learn from them too. So this was Grischuk, MVL. This was one of the later rounds, round 11, I believe. So E4. So Grischuk tries to throw off MVL's dragon. Or not dragon, jeez. Knight of. MVL plays the knight of every game, so this is how Grischuk. A lot of modern players like this D4 line. And the idea looks really weird, but the point is that you take with the queen, on D4, draw back to D2, and the whole point is that you're actually going to just fianchetto and castle. And at first, when I look at this position, I'm like, I don't understand. Like, why can't you just play bishop G7, knight F6, castles? But then after F3, I looked at this position, and I was studying this with my study partner, GM Steven Zierk, who's actually also been, he's also been a GM in residence here quite recently. So he was definitely, and we went over this together, and he was convincing me that, man, this position is just horrible. Because the problem is for black that this bishop on b2 is actually quite a good piece. It defends the king. And it's really hard for black to ever attack. If you try to play a5, I play a4. If you try to play a6, b5, I can just ignore you. And my idea is just to play h4, h5 and start attacking. And it turns out that this is really, really just annoying and really difficult to play. So in the game, though, MVL plays the move bishop h6, and now I really understand this move, because if you don't play this, it's just very unpleasant. Those positions are actually quite annoying to play for the black side. So his idea here is to actually throw off white's coordination, because white doesn't want to play queen d1, then at the very least you could just play back. So for example, if queen d1, you can play a move like bishop d7, and at least to my mind, this is a whole tempo, right? And a whole tempo means a lot. For example, after queen d2, you could even think about taking, right? And then if knight takes e4, then there's bishop takes b2, something like this. All right. So the whole tempo really matters a lot. So maybe you could try queen d3, but now I can probably take on c1, rook takes, and now I feel like the b3 move's kind of wasted. The rook on c1's weird. You can just play knight f6 and just castle, and the exchange of bishops isn't that bad. So I feel like these moves always throw white off. So the idea is that white plays f4. And keep in mind, I don't know this opening myself. Like, I've never really played this for either side. So I don't know much about it. I just know that this is what I went over when I went over it with Steven. And he knew a little bit more about it than I did. So he explained some of these things. But a lot of it was me just trying to figure out the position. So when I saw this, I'm like, wait, bishop h6. Why would you play bishop a6 when you can just play bishop g7? And then it was after looking at that position, playing it out with my study partner after f3, I realized, wait, this position is actually really unpleasant. So knight f6 is what was played in the game. And now bishop b2. And the whole point now is that because you've been forced into f4, your structure is just not as stable. With the pawn on f3, it's more passive, but it also is very solid. And then this idea is just really, really good, right? But once again, if black does just castles a5, you can play a4. You're not really doing that much. So even though the pawn's on f4, I can play here. I can play like h4 later, maybe. It's a little bit unpleasant, maybe. So in the game, he played e5 right away, trying to put pressure on f4. And one of the things with MVL is he's very predictable, but he's also very sharp, which means that he will not be afraid to play the challenging lines against you. I think a lot of players, they're faced with a novelty, they play very safe. And one of MVL's strengths and weaknesses, in my opinion, is that he will not. He will play what he believes is best. He trusts in his calculation to figure this stuff out. And I'm not saying that he was, I think at this point he was still in theory, but he does not shy away from these kind of complications at all. So it either works out really well or it works out really badly. So Grischuk plays knight g2, and you could tell he's still in prep here, which is unsurprising. They're both under 10 moves. So castles, bishop e6. King to b1. You want to get off this diagonal at some point. So MVL tries a4, a5, a4. So at first I was wondering, does it really pay for black to do this? Like, to lock up the queen side like this? But then I realized the problem is that the alternative is to try to play like a6 and b5. And this is just so slow and does so little, right? And then you have to worry about this pawn hanging too. So I realized after a little bit that playing a6, b5 just doesn't help you enough. So I think that the idea of a5, a4 is that now you've kind of reserved this square for the knight, where it can be kind of annoying, hitting the c2 pawn. You have queen b6 ideas, which is what he plays. And then this position also was very, very tricky to understand. So Grischuk played the move h4. And once again, I think he's probably in prep here. Or at the very least, sort of knew. Or actually, no, I think h4, we looked it up later. h4 was a move he spent a lot of time on. And it's a very aggressive move. But at first, I'm like, is it necessary? Like, can white just play h3? And what do you guys think? Can white just play h3? My idea is simply to play d5 next. And I'm banking on the fact that taking here is almost always going to be ugly because you're opening up my bishop on this very strong diagonal. So that's a good question. After a5, how do we react to queen d6? I think the issue with queen d6 is that your queen side and your pieces are a little bit unfortunate here. So maybe the best way to react is actually just to take stuff. So maybe he just takes, and now maybe he takes here. It looks weird, but the point is I can open up the long diagonal without queens, right? Like opening up the long diagonal is not as big a deal. And one of the issues I think white has here is that this knight is actually very, very bad because it blocks this bishop on f1. And you're also having to deal with these knight g4 ideas, which could be very annoying. So I don't know. Because like you could play knight d5, it looks nice and aggressive, but maybe knight takes pawn. And I do want to show something really clever here, which is that rook takes c6 looks very strong at first. Because if I take the rook, then this is, believe it or not, mate. Don't fall for that, boys and girls. But you can take this knight, and I think that this position is actually very, very poor for white. Because white's down a pawn, but also this knight on e2 is just quite bad. Right? It's just a really bad piece because it blocks all your guys. So I think this position is actually quite problematic. So I don't know. I don't think I would grab that guy on d6. But that's why he doesn't take, right? Because I think that he needs it to be a middle game. Because as long as it's a middle game, taking the f4 pawn is just going to be kind of suicidal, right? So like if you try taking on f4 here, for example, and I play knight d5, this looks just atrocious, right? Like look at this guy on the open diagonal. You could try to take this pawn, but I don't know. I would be horribly terrified here. I'm not even so sure you have to play knight d5 immediately, by the way. Maybe that's even a misnomer, but I'm wondering... Yeah, hopefully I didn't lead you astray with that conclusion, but... Yeah, this maybe is not so clear, I guess, because if queen d3... My idea is that on here I can go here, but I don't know. Oops, no, that move is not great. Oh, goodness, what did I do? Alright, yeah. But I don't know, this is a little bit fishy. Maybe you can even just take this knight and play knight f2. Okay, this was a bit too ambitious, guys. Knight d5 is too much, but you don't have to actually take right away. You could play knight takes f4 even. I don't think you get killed by this pin. So I'm wondering here, like, yeah, I mean, the problem is having this bishop open is just really, really strong, I think, after e takes f4. So e takes f4 in the middle game is not going to be quite as strong, right? But in the end game, it becomes a really annoying move. So in the game, he played queen b6, so trying to play very, very aggressively, and I think justified. So he brings this queen out. But yeah, this h4 move. So I guess my first question, though, is what happens if we just play h3? We just kind of play more conservatively. Because this is kind of what I wanted to do at first. But once again, Steven definitely had a better grasp of this than I do. Like, he plays a lot more Sicilians for both colors. Like, he's played some for black, but mostly not as much, but he's played a lot of it for white. And I played a lot of Sicilians for white, but that was over 10 years ago. So his feel for these positions was better. And one of the advantages, I would say, of having a study partner is that there'll be positions which I'll feel better than him and ones where he'll get it more than I will. And having a study partner will help you with that. So if you have a study partner you can look at these games with, it's so valuable. Because I learned a lot just from looking at this position over with him and playing lines out. Because I thought that h3 followed by g4 looked very strong. But he convinced me otherwise. The question is, what idea did he convince me was very good here? So why don't you find the idea that he found, which is very, very good for black? So bishop g7, h5 I think is quite slow. So if this move, for instance, and I play g4, I'm ready to play f5 already, right? And this is going to be very strong. Of course, you could take on f4, and maybe you should, but after knight takes f4, I feel like white's position is quite good here, no? Because I control d5 very well. My pieces are all harmonious. Knight d4, I think I can also take this. So say, actually, I don't know. So if knight takes... Yeah, I'm actually not so sure. Maybe this endgame is decent, but it's hard to say. So it takes... What to do here? Maybe knight here is actually kind of clever now. I don't know if this is necessary, by the way. But the idea of mine is that after if knight takes here, you can simply take the queen, right? So that's not going to work. So you have to try to take this knight. But if you take with the pawn, I thought I could even throw in bishop takes g4. Maybe not. Maybe I just take back. I don't know. And the idea now is if you go for something like this, again, the long diagonal is very, very good for white, I believe. And if you try knight e4, I can still play queen takes pawn, I think. And you have to take this queen, and then maybe even rook takes. You have knight f2 and knight g3, but I think I can move my rook. Like, even this looks very ugly, but I go here, and I think white's just kind of up a pawn here. It's still not completely clear, of course, but I don't know. Probably I would take white, because the bishop can move next. It's not like I'm stuck for the rest of the game or anything. So I don't know. But black has a very, very Sicilian-esque idea, I would say, here. And very, very effective. So rather than try to play knight d4 or use the pieces you have, try to improve and get in pieces that you don't have yet. Maybe, but again, I don't think he wants to. The thing is, this knight is a really bad piece, and I think it's very important that black realizes this and doesn't try to improve it. Very good, Con. So rook a d8, and the whole idea is that now if g4, you play d5. And the whole point is that if you try to play g5 now, I play knight takes d5 with tempo, and the same goes with other tries, right? Like this is just all with tempo. So this just doesn't work out for black. And this idea is actually just very, very strong. Oops, sorry. Because if you try to play, like, if you try to take the pawn or do stuff like this, you're just opening up all my guys. And this is actually quite bad for white, I think. So it's imperative for Grischuk that he play very quickly here. And I think that he appreciated this more than anyone. So he played h4. And h4 is a really, really nice idea. And this was a position where I think that MVL played a bit too casually. So Grischuk's idea of playing h5 is a very, very potentially powerful one. So for example here, playing rook a d8 is still possible, I believe. But it's not nearly as clear because I think I play h5. And the problem is taking on g6 is a huge threat. And the main point is that I get rid of this annoying pin on the pawn as well. And if you try to play knight takes pawn, now you're not threatening d5 at all, right? So even moves like knight d5 become playable. But I have also other options with this, right? I can play g3, which is kind of similar idea to what he did in the game. But mainly it's just knight takes h5 destabilizes him. And if you play d5 and allow h takes g, I think that your position falls apart. Because even if you play knight takes pawn, your bishop on h7 hangs all the time, right? So you could do any number of things here. The simplest is probably just taking this just to get rid of this pawn. And pin the bishop, and I think this is already just a huge disaster, right? So this is not something you'd want to do. So h5, this idea of playing for h4, h5, it seems like it's in every game now, is especially strong here. The question is, what should MVL do? I think his move was a bit lackadaisical, a bit lazy, which again doesn't seem like him, right? But he does play very quickly and kind of by hand a lot. And I would say that this particular position, it's so important to play concretely. And he's usually a very concrete player, which is why I'm surprised. But I think that the move he played in the game was a bit too casual. So what should black do here? What do you think the best idea is against h4? And this is something I analyzed a very long time with Steven, and it's immensely complicated. So it's not easy. But what do you guys think black should do? Yeah, again, knight d4 I'm not so sure about. I think that it's going to encounter some of the same problems we did before. It's black's move here. So in the game he played rook a c8, which is a nice looking improving move, but I think is also not the best. I think black has to be very, very ambitious here. The question is with what move? So I've seen knight d4 mentioned a lot, but again, I feel like this is going to backfire on you somehow. Like you're not really wanting to take to like, again, you're trying to trade off the c2 knight, which is black's worst piece. That's kind of the issue I have with this move. So say if knight takes pawn, pawn takes, there are just too many options here that probably should be okay for black. for white. So say, not exactly sure. Maybe I'm underestimating this too. It's very possible. It wouldn't be the first time. But even a move like knight b5, knight takes, and then like queen e1, something silly. And the idea is d4 hangs next. At any point, I play knight takes d4, I play g3. Like, white's position is now very nice. All my pieces make sense. Everything is kind of okay. So I just really, I don't like fixing this piece. This piece is so bad. And when I see a piece like this, I just don't want to assist it in any possible way. Which means I don't want to play knight d4. I don't want to play ed, ef. And yes, you have to play concretely, but I'd say you can still follow general rules, which is that if your opponent has a piece like this that is just jamming their whole position, you do not try to free it for them. You make them free it themselves. And I'd say this is a good rule of thumb that you guys can follow, because it's just, again, every rule in chess, it's like 60-90, right? Like the rule I give is that nothing's true. Almost nothing is true more than 90% of the time, unless it's like a queen is better than a pawn, right? Or a knight, something like this. But even there, it's like never 100. So, you never assume a rule is 100%, but when you think of a rule, you think, okay, between 60% and like 90%. And I'd say like this is like an 80%-ish, 85%-ish rule, where it's like your opponent has a piece that's really this bad. You just don't try to fix it ever. Like, just leave it be. But white does have a threat of h5, so you have to deal with h5 in some fashion. So the correct move, though, is very aggressive. Like, black tries to make threats of his own. He doesn't try to do anything. Remember, though, the knight on e2, like, it's already kind of bad, right? You don't have to make it worse. So bishop g4 is interesting, but it also doesn't... I'm not so sure it actually helps your cause. Also, I'm not so sure I can't take this pawn now, because your knight now hangs, right? So maybe I could just get away with taking this, and this would be probably not good. So that's something I definitely don't like. Queen f2 is interesting, but again, like, the knight's already kind of paralyzed and terrible. You don't really have to further the cause. Queen f2 is very tempting, though, I will admit. I think the issue is that white maybe just ignores you and plays h5 and claims you're not doing anything. So something like queen f2, maybe I can play h5 and just ignore. And again, I don't know that this is that bad, but... because you could play knight takes h5. Maybe now I play maybe knight here. Centralize my pieces. I don't know. Yeah, but keep in mind with EF, like, I'm not necessarily going to take, right? I'll probably play queen c3 at some point. So again, I'm not saying queen f2 is a bad move. It definitely looks really interesting. But I don't know. I'd be kind of worried about our king side a little bit here. Knight g4 to f2, yeah. So knight g4, oops. Knight g4 I think is the best try. So the idea is that knight f2 is coming, and it is actually a big problem. So knight d5 is an interesting try here. But I think the issue is after bishop takes, pawn takes, knight e7, we didn't really find a great follow-up. But again, it's the stupid knight on e2 is just really bad. So if you try h5 here, for example, I think you could just play knight f2 and take the rook on h1. And if rook e1, you can play knight f5, queen e3, and this is just kind of tough. Because takes, and you take with something, maybe this knight, I don't know. And this knight, again, is just so bad. It is such a horrible, horrible piece. So this is actually just a very big problem. So h5 is kind of what I wanted to do. But even here, it's not so easy. Knight f2. And I can't let you take the h1 rook, because that's my best piece. So I was looking for ways to play like... I was trying to play like rook h2. Which looks very, very odd, right? But the idea is that I'm trying to get in hg. So after knight takes knight, I really want to play h takes g. But the problem is after takes, say knight takes c3, bishop takes f4 is very good. So I have to try queen takes c3. And then queen f2 here I think was annoying. Because I have to play rook h1, but this is not a good sign. Like, if I have to play this passively. So I really wanted to make the rook sack work, but I don't think it does. So I think the best try I came up with was maybe knight takes d1. And the idea is that after bishop back, I have f5. Because here, h takes g is a huge threat. Black has to improve the bishop. So f5, takes, and then queen g5, I think was my idea. And I don't know. I thought that it was at least interesting. But black does have bishop c, king c2, knight rook c8. We were looking at this. And I don't know. It's just immensely complicated. It is very complicated. But again, the fact that this knight on e2 is just so bad continues to haunt white here. So I don't know exactly what we determined was best. And again, like, a computer might know right away, but for a human being, this is nearly impossible. But as you can see, knight g4 is what presents white with immediate problems, and is probably the best point. So he played rook c8, which looks safe enough, but the problem is now h5, and all of a sudden he's in some trouble. So knight takes h5, and this idea of g3 is really, really sweet. So his point is that he's actually not in a rush to attack. He wants to play bishop h3 and complete his development, and claim that his knight on e2 is not so bad after all. And the whole point is that once you open up this h-file, the bishop on h6 is quite bad, the knight on h5 is quite bad, and it's just really an annoying position to play. So just really, really instructive play. So he plays knight b4, and now just bishop h3. And all of a sudden, it's actually really tricky, because if you allow this capture, your pawn structure is actually really bad. Even for the endgame, it's terrible. It's just not solid. So he takes, but now he's given up this d5 square potentially as well, which could be a big problem. So he plays bishop back to g7. And here, once again, Grischuk, I think, comes up with the most accurate way to play. And I would say accuracy is so crucial in these positions, because even if it's very promising, one little lazy move, as we saw, and it could change the whole evaluation. So you want to make sure you're playing in the most accurate way when you have a position this sharp. Because there are some positions you can play slowly and it's correct, especially when it's a slower position. But you have a position like this. Well, again, he's going to try to play for d5 eventually, right? Playing for d5, opening up the center, trying to attack the c2 pawn. Black has ideas. Like, if you play too slowly, eventually something will happen. So it's very important that white got in bishop h3 to trade off that bishop. And now the problem is it's really hard for black to get counterplay. But at the same time, black will eventually get counterplay. Probably maybe doubling even on the c-file, try to put pressure on those knights. Queen f2 is still in the mix, I would say. So I don't think there's no pressure here or anything like that. But you want to be accurate. So what would you do here as white? So f5 followed by g4 is one idea. I don't hate it, but it's a bit slower than the way he played. Very good, Khan. G4. And this is his whole concept, that he doesn't want to give black room to breathe. He wants to basically suffocate black as soon as he can. And this move is very accurate, because if you try taking on f4, I played knight takes f4, takes, and now again I have different options on how to do this, I would say. I think, though, the simplest is probably just queen h2 I wanted, or maybe just rook h1 is the simplest. And the idea is that you're just going to take on h7 next. Then there's no real great way to stop it. If you try h5 or h6, I'm still going to just sack on that square. So I can even play queen here, for example. And rook takes h6 is a common. And once rook takes h6 hits, you're going to be very, very unhappy. Let me put it that way. Like, this position just completely falls apart. So this is kind of what he's going for. Basically just trying to kill him on the king side. So taking on f4 is actually not so great. So he plays knight f6, but now he just loses all sorts of time. He gets g5 in and f5 in. So Grischuk gets all these attacking moves in at black's expense. Basically, like black just has to move the knight back and forth. So this is why calculating those extra lines, playing g4 when it's a tempo move, really comes into play. Because you're trying to advance your attack with tempo as quickly as you can. So when you try to play with like g4, f4, and you're doing it all with tempo, you just get so many extra moves. And getting extra moves in a chess game is very, very important. Already I think MVL's position is very unpleasant, but he's a very resourceful guy. And again, it's one of the things I'm always amazed by when you watch these really top players play, which is that how difficult they are to beat, because they will find every last resource possible, and they just do not die very easily. And MVL played some amazing defense in so many games this tournament. He got in a lot of bad positions, which is why he lost some games, particularly at the end. His opening prep didn't hold up, but like he defended so well. Even in his loss against Fabiano, for example, one of the best games of the tournament, in my opinion, he defended amazingly well. And I feel like that's an ability that these guys have, whereas, you know, GMs of around my level, say, who are 200 points below or so, just like, I'm not saying we can't defend at all, but we're much worse defenders than these guys. Like, we would collapse far quicker. So at least a player like me is in awe of how these guys defend. And I think even when you're going over the games, even look at how the losing player plays and how they defend, because so often they'll defend so tough. And yeah, the prep by Sasha was really good. I'd say it's funny. I put together a list of my favorite candidates games or games I found interesting that I wanted to go over and maybe lecture on. And half of them were Grischuk games, or more than half, like almost all of them. I just find his games so interesting and so rich. Whether he wins or loses, like so many interesting games he plays. And his opening ideas also are very varied and very interesting. So rook fd8 was what was played by MVL here. And in this position, honestly, this was a decision which I recall Steven was not as happy with. And I kind of understood a little bit more because to me it was more positional. But I'm curious what you guys would play here. So the question, honestly, for me is, do you try to play knight g3 and crack at that knight? Or do you play f6? What do you guys think? Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of different. Like for me, um, like the main reason that Steven kind of wanted to not play f6 was because, like, say you have this position. So believe it or not, so we looked at knight f4, but the basic idea is that in this kind of position, right? And say you bring your pieces over. So there's this defensive technique where, let's say this happens just for the heck of it, right? There's this defensive technique where you play h5 and then move the bishop, say, somewhere. And then here, and you try to create your king here. And the whole point is that now it's harder to checkmate. But if white can play takes and opening up your king this way, you're probably still toast. Something like this, knight takes e4 is probably good here. You've probably many winning moves, right? This is a bad example. But basically, because of that structure, you're doing pretty well. Yeah, knight f4 is actually a really crazy idea. And then, like, you can actually sack here and try this, which is actually quite interesting. The idea is if you try to play bishop f8 or something, I play rook h1 and you're just going to get mated. So you have to try something like king here. But I thought king e8 was at least a try. To be fair, though, this is very sketchy. And after either pawn takes or queen takes, it looks very, very close to being busted. So yeah, he killed the bishop, which, I thought was very normal. But one of the points Steven made, which I thought made a lot of sense here, is that in lines where this happens, he at least has some h5 options, with the idea that after g takes h, king h7, there's no more f takes g. And because of this, white's more stopped up. This is a position where black's actually defending very well because there's no clear open line to your king. It's one of those positions where you're cursing the fact you have a pawn here. So this is kind of a common defensive technique. The reason I think it wasn't played in the game is because of exactly how Grischuk crashed through in the game, and I'll show you what I mean. He played d5. And by the way, this is why f6 doesn't kill the bishop that much, because this does get the bishop out. But it definitely makes the king feel very uncomfortable. So he takes, and then knight takes g3 and h5. So this was his whole idea. In this position, by the way, because the thing is, I did could check with the computer briefly. This is one of those decisions where the computer really disagrees horribly. I always check just because sometimes it points out interesting things I miss, right? And this was one of the funny ones, because both Steven and I really like Grischuk's idea. Computer just wants to take and then play rook h1 and says you're just busted because h7 is just going to kill you. I kind of believe it, just because knight e4 is coming, the e-pawn's very weak. And I don't know. This position probably is just very, very good for white. Grischuk played this, which I think is also good enough, but is a little bit trickier. But this is his idea. It looks as if his attack is dead now. But the fact is, it's just begun, because after rook c5, he plays rook h3. And after knight takes d5, he takes and plays here. I think you guys see his idea. Well, I don't know if it was that clear, because I think that in this position, Grischuk very likely would have actually played the same idea he played in the game. He wouldn't have taken, he would have played this move, for example. Or perhaps he would have played this other rook instead. And you know what's coming, right? The sacrifice on h5. And it's actually very difficult to stop this sacrifice in the long term. It's very, very difficult, because once rook h5 happens, your king is just so dead. Again, I would say that's not a rule that I would go by, right? It's like keeping tension is, again, like a 60-40 proposition. There are so many times you're supposed to relieve it because f6 is such a good move to get in. There are times when you're not supposed to. And to give a general rule like that is just really difficult. Everything's dependent on the situation. And I would say, though, that here he didn't really have to relieve the tension right away. But it probably wasn't terrible to do so either. I think it was a matter of taste more than anything else. In any case, it wasn't so much about relieving tension. He wanted to fix black's pawns this way. So h5. So he goes for queen e2. And here, and then rook dh1. So this is where a really, really interesting phase of the game starts. So he wants to play rook takes h5. And I remember looking at this and thinking, this game is almost over. Rook takes h5 is coming, and he is toast. There is no way to stop that. So the question is, how does he stop it? Because MVL comes with some amazing resources here that were actually quite something. Yeah, again, like, there are different situations. I've definitely seen Sicilians, though, where playing g5 f6 is just good, you know? And I would say that especially when you have players of this level who play every type of position, like Grischuk plays d4 lines, he plays e4 lines. He's probably thinking more like a d4 player than an e4 player, of basically gaining all that space and then taking advantage of it. But again, I think in this particular situation, the way he did it should win, right? But leaving the pawn on f5 should also win. I really think it's a matter of taste more than anything else. Like I said, I thought f6 looked okay to me. Steven really didn't like playing f6. He probably wouldn't have. But at the same time, we both agreed it should be good enough to win. Well, bishop g7, the problem is I can just take it. Like, I don't have to mate you, right? Like, I can take a g7 and just be up a piece. So I don't think... I haven't sacrificed anything yet, right? Yeah, I mean, I really am appreciating this bishop on b2. It's such a good piece. But as we saw, MVL could have maybe taken advantage with that knight g4 type move. And that would have made Grischuk's life much more difficult. Even though probably it's still objectively okay, it's not so easy. But okay, how does MVL defend? Put yourself in MVL's shoes. incredible defender that he is, how would you try to defend as black here? It's possible, but what do you do here, right? Keep in mind, after rook d1, I'm not obligated to take your rook either, right? Black's a pawn up, but I would say the pawn up is kind of irrelevant for the time being. Like, I see this a lot where lower players are like say I'm teaching someone who's, I don't know, not new to the game, but like, 1400-ish, right? And they're like, all right, I'm up a pawn, so I should just try to trade off all the pieces. And the fact is that there are some positions you should, and some positions you absolutely should not trade anything. If you have an attack, you should try to trade everything. Here, yes, black would love to trade pieces because they don't want to get mated. But at the same time, an endgame with your king like this, if white is able to win a pawn especially, which is very likely, you're probably still going to be dead. So it's kind of like, it depends which endgame you get, it depends on the situation, and you also need a way. Like, there are plenty of positions where it's like, well, if I trade queens, I'm probably winning. But yeah, but you're never going to trade queens in this lifetime. So it's like, yes, black would love to trade pieces. You're absolutely right. But it's not so easy to do. How do you actually accomplish it? And keep in mind that white's not going to want to allow trades at all. I will say, though, that in this position, it's absolutely the right idea for black. You must want to trade pieces because you're going to have problems. So rook d2 looks like a nice defense, right? But I think the issue with it is that I can actually just take this pawn. You're not actually threatening my queen because of mate. So takes is always losing for the most part. You can play rook d1 check. But I would say that this endgame is actually really, really bad for you. Because now, this king on g8 is just still terrible. I'm still ready to play queen h5, g6, and the e5 pawn's probably just a goner. So what's really funny is even though you've escaped, quote-unquote, to the endgame, this position is actually very bad, I think. Because g6 is just going to be way, way, way too strong. Like, let's say you play e4 here. I probably can just play g6 right away, right? Because if you try taking, I play check. And I think you just get destroyed here. Because my pawn's moving up. I mean, you're still going to get mated. The endgame actually does not save you because queens are still on the board. So I think that this would be an example of why this is also dead lost. So even that position I think is quite bad. MVL played a defense which is probably quite a bit better. It's kind of amazing though, right? Like even you get to that endgame, you're like, all right, I'm safe. And then it's like, no, you're not even remotely safe. It's kind of cruel almost, is the way I would phrase it. Like, it's just cruel. So bishop b4 is possible, but I still don't see how it helps us in the rook h5 lens. I think we still get mated there. So rook d2's already been tried. What other moves do we have? So the move he played in the game was queen d6. And this is quite resourceful because now he's trying to play rook d1 check. So rook takes h5 here. The idea now is I can actually take this way maybe, or at least try it, because if queen takes, I have rook d1 check. So that's kind of the key thing, that you're putting more pieces on the d file. But Grischuk plays a very, very clever move here. What do you guys think white could try? Very good. King a2. Just sidestep the rook move. But okay, MVL still wants it, right? He plays rook d1. Once again, rook d2, rook takes h5, you probably just resign, right? Like, you just don't have any resources now. You just get mated. I saw bishop h6 mentioned. I don't know which position, probably not here, but it never really saves you, right? I just keep taking stuff. So you probably have to try something like rook d1, right? And now I play rook takes h5, which is what was played. G takes h5. But this position was quite amazing. What Grischuk played looks very good, but allows an amazing resource. This part of the game, by the way, is so difficult. Because this was something that I analyzed with Steven afterwards, and we didn't come close to figuring this out. This was so complicated. But I give you a hint. Grischuk played rook takes h5, which looks very strong, but MVL has an amazing resource to try to counter it. And we'll get to that in a moment. But the winning move here is actually very, very subtle. So I'll show you what happened in the game first. He played rook takes h5. And what is black's amazing resource? That's the first amazing thing to figure out. Because it's quite a resource, I will say. So again, put yourself in MVL's shoes for the black pieces. How do you save this game? You're about to get brutally checkmated with queen h2. Or some move like this. So bishop h6, I always take it. It doesn't really help you. Rook a1 check is kind of a cool idea, because if I take with the queen, you can play queen d1. But I think I can take this way. Because you can check me here, but I go back. I don't think you actually do anything. So I think this is kind of okay. Yeah, and queen d2, I want to say rook h1 should do it. Is that true? Is this too much? Maybe this is too much. But my idea is that if you take, I play check here and then here. Oh no, you have queen h6 now. This just doesn't work. In the line after something like e4. Sorry, the line where I was thinking this, was e4. And now I think I can do this because my bishop's open. So after check here, you can't save the game this way because if takes here, I give a check with the bishop. And now queen g8's a threat. So I just mate you. So that's why against e4, rook h8 check, I think works. After queen d2, after queen d2, what do I do here? There is a win, that much I know. But what is it? I know it's here. Queen d2. What's the win, guys? We all have to... Oh, it's queen e4, of course. Yeah, we're threatening queen h7 mate. This just wins. Sorry. Yeah, queen e4. Very good. Yeah, I've just drawn a mind meltdown there. Yeah. So MVL's move was rook d4, which is absolutely amazing. The idea is that after bishop takes d4, you have queen a3 check and takes, and now you have enough resources to draw because you can't play queen h2 yet because of rook d1 mate. So you have to play rook back to h1, and now it sacks, and this is a perpetual. Because you can't try to win because the bishop can come out here, the queen could come down here, so you have to just do this and draw. So something like this is pretty good. So rook d4 was kind of an amazing resource. The best move in this position was rook h3. And the computer showed this to me. I didn't find this. And I was like, what? So here, I guess, like rook a1's like the best try, but it still loses or something. But if you play this move, the idea is that now you play rook takes h5. And if you play MVL's resource, you can simply take it and go here, and you just win. Because the queen's on e6, it's actually a worse square. Because the queen can't go to a3. So after takes here, you just lose. So the rook h3, though. Good luck finding rook h3. But it does win for white. It's completely winning. He played rook to h5, and now rook d4 should be good enough to draw. Grischuk played rook here. MVL takes. Plays queen d5, hitting the rook. He sacks, and this is the whole idea. He sacks for the rook, and I think Grischuk must have missed this. And here he should probably draw, but it's so difficult. The key is that he actually can't capture the pawn on g5 because it gives white too many ideas. Rook e8 is probably the best move. And the idea is that after here you can play b6. And even though white has this extra kingside pawn, it's very difficult to use it because you can never get in g6 so easily. So once I get in this, I can kind of play like bishop c5 and just kind of chill at some point. If queen h6, always bishop f8, I guess. Or maybe chill with a rook on e6 or something like this and just kind of sit. And it's actually very, very difficult for white to ever break through here. But again, this is very difficult to see during a game. In the game, he played rook takes g5, and now Grischuk played queen takes b7 check, which is really sweet. The idea being that if you play rook takes e5, I have check on g2 and check on h2, forking. So he tried rook d2, and now I think bishop f4 was maybe the easiest win. He played bishop c3 instead. Queen check, or queen f c8 here. Bishop takes a5 and won this way. And this was an amazing calculation because at first I thought this endgame should be kind of a draw, or at least close. The problem is this king is actually really, really terrible. And it's very difficult to actually get it in the game. So he tries to come around with king h7. But the problem he has here is that after king d3, bishop c3 guarding the pawn, king c4, so the threat is king d5. You have to do something about that. b4, there's no way to actually get the king. If the king could get here, you'd have a chance at drawing because this bishop kind of holds out the king from these two squares. The problem is you can never get there because if king d6 or some move like this, you have the very, very strong king b5, king a6. And now the problem is you can't actually do that because I'm just going to slowly come up with the board with my pawn. And I think that it's just over, more or less. So I'm able to basically come up the board with my pawn. And that should do the trick. So for example, if here, so I'm ready to kind of come here if you're not careful or something like this. And the point is if you ever go back, I just slide my king over to c6. And that's going to be way too good. Because then my bishop just comes around, eventually lands here. And then I push. So something like this. So in the game he tried bishop d6, but now he can play b5, and the whole point is that after king d7 he plays king d5, very important. If you give him one more move and gets the king to b7, something like this, and plays this and this, it's actually very difficult to win. It's very difficult to actually get your king in. So something like this is often very, very drawish, believe it or not. So it's one tempo, but it's enough. He plays king d5, and now the whole point is that you can't really play king c7 because, well, first of all, this move just wins, right? Just trade bishops. King in here. But there's just nothing he can do. He plays here, bishop d4. If bishop g3, you just play b6. There's, again, no defense to this. So he tried bishop d8 and then b6, and that was it. Because, again, he can't play... I think he may have even resigned earlier, but the idea is that now this is a threat and you have no moves. So you have to try this, and I play king here. I'm ready to do this. You can try one last trick, but this will not work. I'll just check and give it check. And that should be it. Anyways, this was a really complicated game. I hope I at least gave it some justice. It was hard to get through all of it, and the same thing with the Italic game. But I hope you really enjoyed these games. I really liked learning from Grischuk in this game and also learning kind of from my own mistakes, but also looking at some very interesting chess. So I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. And I will see you... the next YouTube lecture I'm going to give, I believe, is on Tuesday for Insane in the Endgame at the same time, 7:30. So I will see you then. Thanks to everyone for tuning in.